So I've always had a sense that a new consciousness is coming in. But being here this week has plugged me into that in quite a new way. It's awoken me to it in a new way. And I now see my work in a much bigger context. And I feel very grateful and humbled for that. I've given my life to this work. First for 20 years in the theatre, and then the last 20 plus years working with more and more senior corporate executives. So I'm right in the core of the mainstream. And what I've built is a way of presenting basically very radical material in a way that's totally accessible and acceptable to extremely over-rational, left-brain dominated people, which is the corporate culture. Very disembodied, very disconnected from emotion, and living very, very much here. So my work is devoted to awakening beyond that. And there's more and more hunger for it, and there is more and more readiness, particularly because I explain in a very coherent way why this is needed. Once there's enough buy-in on a cognitive level, we can dive in then to deep somatic work, which really brings people back in contact with their bodies in a way that they find very surprising, because they're suddenly in a very different state. And then some of what I've been saying makes sense in a lived way. And one of the biggest portals that we have to go through is with the emotions, because there is so much suppression of emotion in the corporate world, so much reluctance to be vulnerable, so much false narrative about we have to not be frightened, etc., that it takes a bit of wrestling to penetrate that. But it always happens. It happens through particular exercises that open the door for vulnerability, and by and large, the majority of people walk through that door. And then we're in a very different territory. Once there is deep vulnerability, once there are even tears, once people can acknowledge the anxiety they're carrying, it's a huge breakthrough. I consider my work to be fundamentally energy work. I'm working with the energetic fabric of individuals and groups. I wouldn't say that at the beginning, but there's a point when I can say that and people will say, okay, yeah, I understand why you say that. At the beginning it would sound too strange. And so because of that, there are two fundamental pillars of work we have to do. And I think this is more than just in the corporate world, or two streams. One is what I would call the awakening stream. It's mindfulness, it's meditation, it's yoga, it's qigong. It's everything that awakens more and more subtle energy and more spacious, ultimately non-dual consciousness. However, the part that I believe is often missing is this part, which is where we work with emotions, we work with personal trauma, we work with intergenerational trauma, and we work with collective trauma, because all of that is locked in the energetic fabric of who we are. And unless that is touched, you can do as many spiritual practices as you want, but they do not melt the contraction, or at least only very partly. And this is the work certainly in the corporate world, but actually I think beyond that is least done. It's much more difficult. It requires courage and requires very skillful facilitation, because we have to make very safe space. And the real depth of that is often done in one-to-one work, and I've been very privileged to have some extraordinary CEOs mainly. And in this work, there's a radical principle in a way, which is that nothing needs fixing, healing, or transforming. It requires us to be safe enough together that the person locates their feeling, and I mean that as a location, physical also, and then is willing to surrender to feeling, to stop fighting it, whatever it is, unconditional. Could be the deepest despair, rage, lost, grief, huge terror. All of these actually eventually need to be unconditionally felt, because then there is an alchemizing process in our nervous system, and there is a melting and a huge opening, actually a huge opening to these practices as well. So when I'm working it's often it'll be more one than the other, but they're also very interconnected. Sometimes after a very deep piece of intergenerational work, which means we're feeling the trauma in the lineage beyond my own trauma. I'm really feeling the trauma of my parents, my grandparents. Often after that, there's such a relaxation in the whole nervous system that very high meditative states become immediately available. It's a great, great privilege to do the work. And I never planned to be working in the heart of the business community. I've followed the crumbs, and that's where they've led me. It's not what I planned at all. In fact, I never thought I'd leave the arts. So there is a feeling of I've always just followed the next step, and it's led me to what I now really celebrate and feel of great value, to work within that community and have the kind of messages of this new consciousness, which, by the way, also produces much better business results. It has to, otherwise it wouldn't be listened to. But within that, of course, we also work with purpose, which then engages a deeper conversation about my contribution. So I make very clear I'm not here to help you make more money. That may happen. But I'm here for much bigger consciousness that includes what's your real contribution to the greater good.